Hi everyone, I'm Sunil Kalgi, the CEO of Outclip. So today I'll be speaking with Hareesh Nagarajan, a product manager at Google. He's been at Google for more than 10 years, where he's been a product manager for the last 7. He's worked on many product lines, including Gmail, Google Fiber, and most recently, mobile search ads. So Harish, thank you for doing this interview.
Well, thanks, Sunil. Yeah, it's great to be here.
So I have a basic question to start off this interview. So product management is something that we never taught about in school, right? You go to college and you're taught software engineering and among other things. You also have software project management and so on, but not so much product management. However, it's a very core role in tech companies, and I think it is pioneered by the Bay Area startups and so on. So can you tell us what does a product manager do?
Yeah, so I think historically, when you think about this particular role, it's been around for as long as software has been built, right? I think the PM role has been around from the 60s. I think it got popular in the 90s, and I think you can read some of Ben Horowitz's essays on product management. Um, I think then product management was a bit different. You built software, you kind of had a hypothesis, you tested it, you shipped it out, and then you send it out, to your clients and your customers. And then you got the feedback only maybe 6 months from now on how the product was being used. The big difference between product management then and now is we get feedback constantly. You have services which are running online, so you can look at the data, you can see what's working, what's not working immediately. So in a nutshell, what a product manager does is for any kind of mature product or a product that already exists is really look at what the business goals are and then come up with product changes to achieve some of those business goals. Now, of course, this is not the general answer for every product management role. I think for smaller startups, for smaller companies and smaller startups, sometimes the CEO or the founder is the product manager because they have a very good understanding of where the product should go, who the product works for, and who the users are. And then they really are the nucleus. They understand what product management is really for that particular product. But over time, when you have products that have been around for a while that have gotten users, then it's a lot about, hey, what is this new feature that we can provide? What is this new business objective that we want to achieve? At that point, the more conventional PMs can come in and really um, take the product in the right direction because you have to constantly evolve. And I think PMs are the one group of people within these organizations that help a product evolve. Yeah.
So you mentioned, I mean, a PM's job and some of the more established companies is really coming up with new features and new products. So I read a recent press release for one of the products that you shipped, which is mobile search ads. So can you tell us about like how you conceive new products and features as a PM? Where does it originate from? Where do those ideas come from?
Yeah, so again, on mobile search ads and on Google Ads, there's just a phenomenal number of features, a phenomenal number of products. And so I worked on this one small, product within the whole AdWords product suite. So I won't specifically talk about that, but I can talk about how ideas are conceived. So usually, when we learn software engineering in school, at least I learned it in the early 2000s. Software engineering would be about gather requirements. Yeah. But the thing is, out in the field, requirements are not just hanging out on the floor for you to walk and pick them up and you gather them. It's not that easy. If only it were that easy. In many cases, even if you ask users what they want, they won't be able to tell you what they actually want, right? So you need to synthesize what it is that is needed. It could be any particular metric that you're optimizing for or you want to see improved. It could be, do you want to increase session time? Do you want to get users to spend more time on the product? You could be working on a recommendation algorithm. Do you want people to actually spend less time because you want them to, finish whatever task they had planned and get on their way? If you were adding a product onto an Amazon shopping cart, you don't want that to take forever. You want them to add it, check out, and be done, and you want to sort of optimize for conversions. So I think it really depends on what particular feature or what the business goal is that you want to achieve. in most cases, you're not starting from a blank slate. You're starting from a slate that's already in progress, a product that a line that already exists, a feature that already exists, and you're figuring out what is broken with it. And you primarily have a few tools in your arsenal. You can either do um, um, quantitative um, analysis. You look at the data and you see what is working, what's not working, or you can do something qualitative. You can get user research to ask some questions to users. You could put out surveys, right? You can physically go and talk to customers if you have those customers. So I think you can do a blended approach of both these things, but nobody's going to tell you what to build, right? And I think that really comes down to um, your synthesis of the qualitative and the quantitative aspects, and then building a story, constructing a story of yourself, evangelizing that story with engineers, and then get the ball rolling to actually build that, whatever that something is that you want to do. And then you just you get that out, then you test that out, and then you repeat the process all over again. So I think it's a lot of it is just continuous development, a continuous iteration, and having a tight feedback loop is super important in product management.
So you like once you're so let's say you found you come up with the requirements for a new feature or product, um, and you put forward a proposal and it gets accepted by the team. The engineers are willing to build it and so on. So what then are your next tasks? Like what do you create in order to enable engineers and other stakeholders to proceed with development of the feature?
Yeah,
What are your
so
deliverables and that sort of thing?
yeah, so it starts with once again, a goal that you want to achieve. For example, I usually think of these things as two types of goals. One, the business has given you the goal. The business has told you a goal. Hey, PM, try and make sure that people reduce the churn rate on a particular product. You could be a PM on Spotify, and you could be responsible for making sure that people don't churn as much. The churn would mean they're canceling the subscription. So what are the levers that you have? You can change pricing. You can say, hey, you know what? I'll give you this product for free for the next 3 months. And then that might not fly with the revenue teams. They might say, hurry, sorry, you can't use that lever. So then you could try and figure out other ways of potentially doing this. You could potentially have some speed bumps in place. You could potentially tell this user that, hey, you know what? These are these other features that you haven't really used. Or you could tell them, hey, you've actually stored so much information here. Maybe you don't want to cancel. Maybe you're actually you forget that that you have actually derived a lot of value from this. But of course, if users wanted to go ahead and cancel, they will still cancel. So anyway, the point of it is, if there's a business goal and that business goal is well established, then you can devise any number of features for achieving that business goal. And then you would write down a spec, you would evangelize it with your immediate team, with your engineering team. You sort of communicate this to your leadership and tell them that this is on. You'd communicate timelines because that needs to be done. You would work with the UX teams to build some kind of user flows for whatever this new proposal is. And then you would get cracking, right? You could then estimate it closely with your engineering counterpart and say this could take 6 months, or this could take 2 months, or whatever, right? And then you get this out, and then you see, did it actually change the metrics, right? You run some A/B experiments along the way, and you're like, oh, you know what? I actually reduced conversion. I reduced the cancellation rate in my cohort of users who saw my particular change by 5%, right? If 100 people were canceling on the control on your experiment, you only got 95 cancellations. So you did better. And you can probably say that this is because of your change. Again, that's A/B experiments and that kind of construction. You want to make sure that you constructed the experiment properly. So that's one way. There's a clear business goal, you've achieved it and done. The other way is more bottom up, right? Nobody has told you that, hey, you know what, you need to make this change to a particular feature. You propose this thing organically, and then you start evangelizing it to people, and then say, if you did this, this is what you could move. This is the pain points today. People bounce out. They don't realize that they can actually do this thing. But then if you add this particular feature, they will do this thing, and doing this thing is good for the business, is good for the product, and then you sort of bubble it up. So both are similar. I think in each of them, it's how do you go about selling the idea? In the first case, it's simple. The business is bought into it. In the second case, the business doesn't even know this is a particular problem. You have estimated this to be a problem. And so you have to do the job communicating. You have to do the job cheerleading. You have to do the job of shepherding. So in the end, it's the same thing. I mean, we often like to call this is how the sausage gets made. And sometimes making the sausage is messy. I think building software is inherently messy. But it starts from these things, either top down or bottom up.
So in the bottom up case, how do you personally go about gathering requirements and data? Like who do you speak with and figure out new ideas for how to change the product?
Yeah, I mean, as a PM on most products, you have to be focused on engagement, whatever engagement means to you. If you're a PM on YouTube, a simple way of looking at engagement is, are people spending more time on YouTube, right, as viewers? But if you are the PM on the team that actually works towards artists, then engagement time could mean something totally different, right? You don't care about engagement time as much, but are they having a good experience? Is their video showing up to enough number of users? So you need to see what metric matters to you. And in many cases, engagement, because products, you have to engage with the product. If you don't, there is no product. So you look at engagement and you see there's something that's broken, right? In some cases, it is, hey, you know what? People are not seeing performance with this thing. People are not adopting this thing. People are trying this once, but they're not trying it again. Or people are spending X amount with this thing, but they're not going above Y. And we expect them to, once you spend more than Y, you see a product has actually gained some traction. So you figure out something. I think back in the early days of Facebook, they would say you need to get 10 friends on Facebook. If you get 10 friends on Facebook, you'll be an engaged user. But if you were at 4, maybe you'd churn. If you're at 8, you would churn. So your goal was very clear. How do I get this user signing up to get 10 friends in there? So I think you would need to figure out what that North Star is or what that metric is. And then relentlessly come up with some way of doing measurement to see if that metric that you're working on has actually moved in the direction that you want it to. So I think it's a bit about your own intuition, your own understanding. You need to talk to different people. You need to talk to your customers, and then come up with a story, right? A narrative. Oh, if I did X and Y, maybe Z will improve, and Z is what we ultimately want. And then do the same thing. Evangelize it. Talk upstream. Talk horizontally with the rest of your team. Spec it out, and shepherd it towards launch. And then be the cheerleader too. You need to cheerlead these things. And as PMs, we sometimes forget that we are the number one cheerleaders for these changes that we are driving.
So you mentioned running different kinds of experiments to validate your hypothesis. So it's an aspect of testing, right? You keep testing whether the feature you've spec'd is actually moving the metrics in the right direction. So can you tell us about, you mentioned A/B experiments. Can you just describe what those are and maybe talk about any other kinds of experiments that you run?
Yeah, so an A/B experiment is a pretty simple concept to understand. Let's say you have a form on a page, and the form says that, hey, if you're interested in buying widget X or getting a demo for widget X, type in your name, email, and phone number, right? And tap submit. And an A/B experiment would be, hey, you know what? If we gave people 3 fields, only 30% are filling up the form. What if we did away with the phone number field? Maybe we don't need the phone number field. Maybe we can bump up our conversion rate to maybe 40% from 30% if we took away the phone number field. And so an A/B experiment would be, let's remove the phone number. And then let's send 50% of users the name, email, and phone number, and the other 50% who are in the experiment, just the name and email. And then see what business objective we want to achieve. And the goal is still the same. We want to see conversions. And then we are like, you know what? Conversions didn't change at all, right? In which case the experiment didn't change anything. Or maybe the experiment showed we could bump the conversion rate from an absolute 30% to 40% now, and there was statistically significant numbers. In many cases, getting statistically significant numbers are very difficult because most of us don't have the large scale of, say, Google or Facebook, where we can run experiments with millions and millions of impressions and traffic. But I think more or less we should have a sense for directionally, did this experiment make sense? And then you deploy that experiment. Hey, you know what? We no longer need to ask for phone number. So A/B experiments are one way to do it. But the downside with A/B experiments are they are fundamentally, if you're at a local minima or if you have just seen a certain type of performance, you can't get a step change improvement. It's very difficult through an A/B experiment to get a 2x improvement. And the key with A/B experiments is you don't want to change too many things. You just want to change one thing. If you change three things, you don't know which of these things actually cause the change. Some other ways of doing this is really coming down to intuition, right? What am I trying to do? And then what are we trying to achieve? And then maybe you might have to redesign the entire form entirely, right? So it really depends on that. There are a lot of systems that let you do A/B experimentation, but I think you should really find one that you're comfortable with that suits you. At Google, there's very complex and sophisticated systems that we use, so we don't often have to deal with building such a framework. But for people out there, I think A/B experiments can come later. I think the big thing would be to focus on what does your intuition tell you, what does your data tell you, and just iterate on that. That's a lot better than doing some of these A/B experiments, which help you at scale, right? And they are what we often call low-hanging fruits. I hate that term, but it is what it is. It is a low-hanging fruit. Hey, you can like take this off. Now, in this particular experiment, we are like, okay, you know what? We saw more conversions, but because we saw more people submit the lead, but other leads are the same quality. Did we lose quality along the way, right? And so that's when you start piecing the story. Yeah, we got more leads, but maybe when they didn't give the phone number, we saw more rubbish emails put in. So I think it's a trade-off. So you really need to understand in the whole system, did that work better? I saw more people come in to this form and submit it, but was the quality on the other side good enough? So I think that's why you need to look at this end to end as a whole story. These quick wins come in only when you've totally grasped and understood the system.
Now, another aspect of building new product and features is how to price it. So, what are some of the important things to know about, like pricing products?
I think it's a very good question. I think there's definitely a behavioral aspect to this. I actually do not have that much experience in pricing. Internally, on some products that we have worked on, I've made use of pricing teams that have done some sophisticated pricing analysis to really test the market to see which places are the most receptive. But if I were in the shoes that I had to come up with pricing by myself, I would really look at the large body of SaaS softwares that are out there today, and then use them as an anchor towards pricing. It really depends on the market that you're in. SaaS softwares, right? There's a certain expectation that you price it a certain way. Enterprise software are priced totally differently, right? You could find an enterprise sales for a company which is in the tens of thousands or even hundreds of thousands of dollars. Whereas if you are like a turnkey API company, there's very clear pricing that you could end up doing. And let's say you're SendGrid and you're doing emails, or Mailgun, you're doing emails, or you're doing Twilio, you're generating SMS numbers. I think that kind of pricing is very clear cut how it's done. So you should really step on the body of work of others in the community and what they've done. So pricing, I don't really have a good answer for you, but I think it is a key aspect of how do you go about pricing software.
Now, as a PM, what's your typical time horizon? Like, I mean, are you looking at projects 6 months out, 1 year out? Because I know that product managers definitely are in charge of the product roadmap, for instance. So just curious about like how far out do you actually see and plan ahead for?
Yeah, so I think usually with any product you have typically a strategy document where you're like, where is this product headed? Either that could come from your leadership, and you translate that into what it means to your particular team and the particular sub niche that you're working on. And the strategy doesn't change that often, right? I mean, yeah, you might add a few things here and there, but you're not going to change it that often. It might be big, broad themes. We need to grow revenue. We need to grow strategy. We need to be in different markets. We need to execute better in terms of our sales. We need to, get increase the revenue that we get per user, and so make retention stronger. So you might have a broad set of strategy of what you want to do. And then the roadmap is really the tactics, right? The roadmap is hey, this is how this dovetails with the strategy. These are the different things that we're working on, which are part of the roadmap, and sorry, which are part of the strategy. This is when they come. So usually strategy, I would say, is maybe 1 to 3 years out, right? It's constantly evolving, but not as frequently. Roadmap is more of a living doc. It's constantly evolving, but with the roadmap, you're looking usually a year out max. Again, you have the greatest visibility into a quarter and the quarter after that. And then, of course, each of these items in your roadmap will eventually need PRDs and UX reviews. It might need engineering design reviews, and all of that. But so roadmap is usually about a year, 2 years long, not more than that. Strategy is about 3 to 5 years, again, not more than that. Roadmap changes often, strategy doesn't change it that often. And you align a roadmap with a strategy doc, usually.
So switching gears a little bit about kind of PM day-to-day stuff. So PMs, you typically work in cross-functional teams with engineering. So you spec things out, engineering builds it. So what are some of your tips for how to work well with the engineering team?
Yeah, I think that's a yeah. I think that's a great question, right? How do you work well with your engineering team? I think this is pretty much a general question that kind of applies to any role. How do you work well with your teammates? I think, or put differently, how do you gain the respect of your teammates? I think you gain the respect by really providing value, and by providing and building trust and confidence. They build trust and confidence in you. You build trust and confidence in them, and then you become partners. I think sometimes what ends up happening on the product side is when the engineering team looks at PMs as adversaries instead of partners, or vice versa. As PMs might look at engineers as only people who are there to build whatever you are telling them to. And that's never a healthy relationship. I think it starts with mutual respect. You respect the other person, they respect you, and you work in a collaborative way to add value. Because as we know, software is not built in isolation. I think it takes many cooks sometimes, each one doing something very different, to actually build software that is successful and that generates a lot of value to people these days. So I think it would also start with understanding what engineers have to go through. So for example, if somebody ends up saying, hey, you know what, we need to redesign the system because it doesn't work well for us, and if you as a PM understand what that is and why that's happening, you again build a lot of credibility. If they were telling you that, hey, we need to run a distributed, we need to actually, and it's an example from a few years ago, I don't know if it is still relevant, that we need to run a map production to actually get this information, right? Then you need to quickly understand what that means, right? And you only do that so that you understand what they're going through. Again, it's about you're empathizing with them, right? And this can be used to bake into timelines and roadmaps, because what do you want? You don't want to project unrealistic timelines. You don't want to say, hey, engineers, can you get this done by next week or by end of day today? And they'd be like, hey, this is more complex than you are giving this credit for. So I think it's about building respect, building trust, understanding this engineering system, understanding them, understanding where they're coming from, and being a healthy peer, right? And giving them, there's a healthy balance and a healthy tug of war between the two of you. I think when there's a little good tension between engineering and PM teams, that is when I think the best product gets built. I think engineers shouldn't say, whatever the PM gives me, I'm going to implement. And a PM shouldn't be like, oh, whatever the engineer says, I should just take. I think once you build that trust and understanding, I think if you can be a person that really understands where the other person is coming from and challenge them a bit, and I think that is when PMs and engineers can work really well as one team.
So how do you measure the performance of a product manager? I mean, for engineering, it can be measured in terms of whether the feature is shipped on time and whether there are a few bugs in the product. But what do you look for in a good product manager to decide if someone's really good at their job or not?
Yeah. So I think you just mentioned bugs. I think the culture out here in the Valley, and I'm sure elsewhere too, has moved to blameless postmortems. You don't want to blame anyone for anything. So we have definitely moved away from lines of code. We know how irrelevant that is. I think it should really be focused on outputs rather than inputs. So it's not like, oh, I spent 10 hours specing this feature. Nobody cares if you spent 10 hours, right? I think with time, things have moved towards not just launches, right? So one yardstick is clearly, did this PM launch this particular thing? It's not just launches. How was the landing, right? They launched this. Imagine you launched a rocket, but the rocket didn't land where it was supposed to land. That's not a success. So focus on landings, not just launches. I think that is important. And also impact, right? If you ended up doing something which didn't impact anything, it's not very useful. If you launch this particular thing and it did not see any adoption, that's not very helpful. So I think really focus on impact and relentlessly, communicate that story, relentlessly iterate on what you've built. I think that is what that's one way of measuring a good PM. I think storytelling is another way of measuring a good PM, right? But that doesn't really tell you if this person executes well. So internally, I think we use yardsticks like, how does the person communicate? Does the person provide product insight? How did the person execute? And did the person generate an impact? I think this applies to any job for that matter, but it's more of a thing with product management, because again, if you don't launch, if you don't deliver impact, then it isn't very good for the product.
So, what are some of your kind of personal best practices for like evangelizing and selling ideas to stakeholders and management?
Yeah, so
Because ultimately, you're trying to sell them on like, hey, we need this is the direction we need to move in, or work on this feature or product.
Yeah, so again, it really depends on the organization that you're in. Is it a big one? Is it a small one? What is your sphere of influence, right? So again, I think you need to read the organization. I think, yeah, as a PM, that is one of the first things that you really need to understand. Who are the decision makers? Who are the key stakeholders? And really work with them. But I personally am a very bottom-up kind of product manager. Having been an engineer before as well. So I think it usually starts with working very closely with engineers and building a story with them on, hey, you know what, maybe this is something that we could do, or hey, you know what, I've heard this from the our users, or I've heard this from the sales teams, and maybe this is a good thing for us to build. Hey, because then the data is telling me that too. So it'll really come down to talking to your engineers, building a story that is with some data, with some intuition, with some anecdotes, and then refining that story. And once you've refined that story and you kind of have a good agreement with your peer engineering team, and then you start shipping it across teams with your leadership, with other leadership that's involved. And then it depends on the organization. If the organization has good processes in place, you start following those processes and sort of move that idea forward and make that a reality. So I think that's an approach that I've often taken, which is a bottom-up approach.
So a lot of a PM's job is, of course, also speaking with customers, right? Being outward facing in order to gather people's perspectives and ideas for future product development. Again, so how do you talk to customers? What are some of the things you avoid and some of the things that you should do in order to gather information, good information from customers?
Yeah, I think it also, I think having a good feedback loop with your customers and your users is super important. I think it does depend, it changes, varies company to company. A company like Google and Google Ads is a very big team, so we have multiple layers of getting such feedback. In a smaller team, you'll be more responsible for getting this feedback directly. Maybe you're getting it from your support teams. Maybe you're getting it from, again, your sales leadership. So it really depends. Um, um, on my end, I think it's super important to get feedback from customers. Why? Because you could be sitting in your ivory tower out here in Mountain View building something, but your users might be in India, your users might be in Argentina. So you really need to get a sense for how is it working in all these different markets, and what pains are they seeing? How are they using the particular product? So the way I've done it is, just like we are video conferencing today, I've done video conferencing. That is can be extremely useful, and keeping the channel open with them. Email is obviously another option, and and also field trips, like actually going out in person and talking to them in a very structured environment, either something that's organized by sales teams or support teams, and getting feedback. I think a mix of all three, and then being systematic about processing that feedback and referencing it whenever you want to. I think meeting customers, one of the big advantages is really sometimes they'll have an interesting quote or something that can really stick with you, and that can help sharpen and build your narrative. And I think that to me is a super important aspect of actually talking to customers. They might tell you something that, hey, you know what, that's an
Yeah.
amazing way of describing this thing. And then you can use that in your own storytelling going forward.
And sometimes you even have to subtract from product, like retire or deprecate old features. So how do you communicate this to customers, and what's the best way to do it?
Yeah. So I think having built software for about 10 years, I've seen there's two things that we primarily do. We either ship things or we unship things. And both are super important. The same way you add code and then you have another set of people who 2 years later start deleting the code. So I think it really comes down to, again, PM is a lot about storytelling and about managing that story. And then, of course, everything follows with it. So if we are sunsetting a particular feature or a particular product or a particular workflow that the user had, it starts with giving them some kind of deadline that this thing is going away and telling them that, hey, you know what, we also have this replacement. And C, maybe we made it super easy for you. We've actually moved it from A, which is going away, to B, which is what we are introduced. And all you have to do is tap this button and then say, hey, you know what, I'm moving entirely to B. Or if you don't do it within time, B is going to be the de facto source and A just goes away. So again, it comes down to communication. It comes down to telling them there's a viable alternative in place, and sort of following up with that. I think it's not a super important thing though. I think it really depends on the use case. In Outlook, for example, I'm sure there are features that you have seen adoption for, and as well as other features you want to retire. Sometimes you can also remove some things, and you know what, nobody might notice. That could either be a good thing or a bad thing. But I think having some consideration for the user, that hey, they've used this thing and now you're taking away something that they've used. I think communicating upfront is super important, and that is just going to make them happy that you care about them.
Next, I want to tackle the topic of hiring for product managers. So how do you go about interviewing? I'm sure you've done countless interviews for PMs. So how do you interview product managers? What do you look for?
Yeah, so I think it's some of the things that I've already covered today. And this is usually in the PM rubric at companies out here in the Valley, right? We are looking at analytical skills. Is this person analytically strong? Does this person bring product insight? And insight is something that is very difficult to measure directly, right? There's no question that I could ask you. If I asked you, hey, you know what, sort these numbers using a sorting algorithm of your choice and write that code, is very objective. There's a right way and there's a wrong way. So we're trying to figure out if this person has product insight. And in some cases, maybe you don't need that product insight. Maybe it's a very technical product. So again, we're looking at quantitative skills. We're looking at product insight. We are looking at, is the person able to communicate? And we're also figuring out what product is this person going to manage. As I said, right, many products are mature. They've been around for a while, or it has captured some product market fit, and you're not still searching for that product market fit. And so in this case, you're really looking at somebody who can execute, who can understand the existing roadmap, and then tie to the business goals that have already been established and really move that product forward. So these are the things that we try to sort of evaluate in the interview. I'm sure this is going to be very different for if you're a company of just 10 or 15 people and you're hiring your first PM. I think the interview, the type of questions you want to ask will be very different. So you're looking at intelligence. You're looking at, has this person built software, and does this person understand what it takes to evolve the software? And of course, as some people have said, they have to be PM junkies themselves. They have to be product junkies themselves. Are they trying out new products? Do they have opinions? Can they talk about anything under the sun? Can they talk about what should government do tomorrow? Can they talk about that? Can they talk about Dropbox, even though they know nothing about Dropbox and its pricing? So I think it's a bit about that. Are they following the field? Do they have a sense for where the industry is headed, and have opinions? And you want to capture some of that in the interview.
So question about your personal background. So you were a senior software engineer at Google. before you decided to make the switch to PM. So how was your transition to PM, and did your engineering background actually serve you well in easing into a PM role?
Yeah, so I can maybe start with the second question. I think the PM background did, I mean, sorry, the engineering background did help me. I think it helped me because it just helped me build a credibility with engineers. But I think we should make it very clear, you don't need to have a technical background to be a good PM. In fact, a lot of PMs I know out here do not even have engineering backgrounds, and they are pretty phenomenal, right? It's about adding value. It's about really figuring out where this product should head. Is what really makes or breaks a great PM. In terms of why I switched over to product management from engineering and how that transition was. Um, I just felt like I had done quite a bit about the what to build. Sorry, the how to build things, right? I was given a task and I figured out how to build software this particular way. I figured out how to build some distributed systems along the way. And then in the process, I was very interested in the what should we be building, right? I really at the intersection of the business, really at the intersection of evolving an existing product that already exists, or even conceiving new products. And I've done some of this as an engineer too, on internal products. And then I thought, hey, you know what? As I'm approaching a new decade in my life, maybe it's a good time to try product management because I mean I'm a software and a product junkie. I've been building software since my teenage years, and it just felt like a good fit for me. I could talk technology. I knew what it took to build software, and along the way, I was also involved with conceiving um, features and softwares. And so it seemed like it was a logical and a good transition for me. And it's not for everyone. I think you really need to see what your personality type is. That can you sort of abstract yourself away from the actual act of building, but still be very close to the building, right? But not exactly building, right? Because if you're actually building the software, then you're not doing your job as a PM.
Awesome. So my last question for you. So you mentioned about how when you're hiring someone for a PM role, you expect them to be, you're looking for product junkies, right? Somebody who's totally into product, all kinds of products, being able to kind of think deeply about and articulate what they see in other products. So about your habits personally, so what blogs, YouTube channels, Twitter, newsfeed, etc., do you follow for to update yourself on product and be a better product manager? What are your sources of information?
Yeah, I think once again, that's a good question. Maybe sometimes it's probably a good thing to not be looking at Twitter and other channels because I think, as we all know, that we might just fall into a rabbit hole, and that is not it's not a very productive rabbit hole to fall into. So usually my sources of input are, I would say, TechMeme. TechMeme is one, just to get a pulse for what's happening with the big companies out here. Then Hacker News. I think Hacker News is a key part of my reading and all the stuff that comes in there. I would say Seeking Alpha is a very good data point for me too, especially following young companies that have just IPO'd and seeing how they're positioning their companies, how they are talking about their companies now that they've recently gone public. And this could be the names that people don't often talk about. It could be Anaplan in San Francisco. It could be Coupa Software in San Mateo. It could be SendGrid that was recently purchased by Twilio in I think it is Denver or Boulder. I forget exactly where. So again, then you get a sense of how are these people actually positioning their products? How are they evolving their suite of products? And it helps you shape and form your own opinions. So I would say these three sources. Of course, there's the news sources. There's articles from friends, and there's internal Google discussion forums that I'm a part of. But I would say these are some three big pillars, sources of inputs for me.
Awesome. All right, Harish. Yeah, this concludes kind of the interview. And thank you so much for sharing your invaluable advice and perspective on product management. I learned so much from it. I mean, you put in so many years in product management, and you've got a lot of kind of awards and so on to go with it. So it clearly shows. Yeah, glad to have you do this interview, and thank you so much.
Well, thanks, Sunil. I'm not sure about awards, and I hope I didn't ramble and bore your listeners. But you know, I hope you see great success with Outclip. I'm a user. I'm a fan.
Thank you so much. Bye bye.
Cheers, guys. Thank you.
Cheers. Cheers.